Well, once upon a time, in order to do the history of unity, I have to go back a little further. I have to go back to a man in Germany named Dr. Mesmer. You've heard the word mesmerize, came from him. He became fascinated with the relationship between mind and body. And he developed a procedure which we would call hypnosis. And he would go to concert halls and he would have people come up and he would hypnotize them and do a healing for them while they were under, make a suggestion to their mind that would carry forth into their bodies. He came to this country, he came to Maine for an extended period of time. And he trained a man named P.P. Quimby. P.P. Quimby is probably my favorite guy in the history of New Thought. He developed this. He took it further than Mesmer ever had, and he traveled a little bit around New England, but he never went on book tours. He never wrote a book. He never tried to make money off what he was doing. He just sat on his front porch, and people would come to him and he would heal them, he would teach them. He was the first person to have a long distance relationship. He would say, be in your room alone at 4 o'clock your time and I will join with you in prayer. And he taught a number of important people, important to the Unity movement, important to New Thought. And one of them was Mary Baker Eddy. Mary Baker Eddy went down to Boston, of course, and founded Christian Science. What she did was add religion to his scientific approach. You see what I mean? He was just all about the science of it, but she was perceptive enough to see that there was something else going on. She taught, among millions of people probably, a woman named Emma Curtis Hopkins. Emma Curtis Hopkins became her prize student, in fact became the editor of Christian Science magazine for a period of time, until they had a grievous falling out over the question of exclusivity. Mary Baker Eddy became very possessive of her teachings and said that she and only she was the authority who could speak for the divine. She had it put in their constitution, in fact, that they could never change the constitution without her written permission. She's been dead, a century now, so it's hard to get her written permission. Emma Curtis Hopkins felt that this was a universal truth, that it was available to everyone, that anyone could be trained to become receptive to spirit. So she left and moved to Chicago and established a metaphysical school in Chicago. She trained so many people. She became known as the mother of New Thought because so many people would study with her and then they'd go home and form a little study group for themselves. So there were little groups scattered around, particularly in the West. And a lot of them dissolved eventually or became combined. In fact, my first church in Beaverton, Oregon was in a former Science of Mind building. So, Emma Curtis Hopkins taught a man named E.B. Weeks. And now the story gets interesting. We have to back up. Myrtle Fillmore was born in Ohio in 1845. Charles Fillmore was born on a Native American reservation in Minnesota in 1854. She was 9 years older than he was, which was not as acceptable then as it is now, so that was kind of a scandal. Myrtle studied, but she didn't attend because women were not allowed on campus. but she studied with what was called the Literary Course for Ladies at Oberlin College. And with that training, she became a teacher. Now, Myrtle had been sickly all her life. She had been told from birth that her family inherited a tendency to tuberculosis. And she lived her life believing that she had within her this potential disease, and she had to be very, very careful to make sure it didn't express, it didn't become manifest. So she moved to southern Missouri. Why that would be a safe place from the tuberculosis, I have no idea. And she lasted there one season, and she moved to Denison, Texas. Again, I've lived in Texas. I never thought it particularly healing, but no mind's there. So let's back up and look at Charles. Charles was pretty much self-taught. He was in a skating accident when he was young, and as a result, he walked with a limp all his life. Although they say, and I have no reason to doubt them, they say that it became less and less noticeable as the deeper he went into truth. He set off, he became a printer's devil, running around carrying the type and doing whatever needed to be done. And his boss's wife noticed that he was very, very intelligent and curious. He had a thirst, an absolute thirst for knowledge, and did all his life. And she began giving him things to read, Shakespeare, Emerson, Thoreau, and he absorbed it all. He left there to make a fortune in the West, in Colorado, and he made a fortune, and he lost a fortune, and he made a fortune, and he lost a fortune. He was a speculator, and sometimes it paid out, and sometimes it did not. After he ended up in Denison, Texas on business, and was there for a significant amount of time, several months. And he joined a book discussion group because it was his passion. And another member of that group was Myrtle. And that's where they met. And they formed an immediate bond. He left again to go back to Colorado, but their correspondence, we still have copies of their correspondence, and it's beautiful. It's not romantic, it's spiritual. It's really, they just were discussing it spiritual. Myrtle, I remember one letter where Myrtle says, they were both Methodists. Unity is founded in the Methodist tradition. But Myrtle said, I really find myself closer to God when I go out into nature than when I go to church. Eventually, Charles joined her in Missouri, and they married and went back to Colorado. Eventually, they had 3 children. Well, he continued to the up and down, winning and losing process in his life. And at one point, they were forced to move first to Omaha and then to Kansas City, Missouri, where they settled. It was in Kansas City that Myrtle attended a series of classes by E.B. Weeks. And it was during those classes that she had her revelation. Not because he told her this, but because in the energy of his teaching, she suddenly thought, I'm a holy child of God. I don't inherit sickness. You know, this, I've been lying to my body all my life. That can't be true. This is, I am spirit. And she set about a process of going in meditation to every part of her body and apologizing for the damage she had done through her mind. And she had been given 6 months to live at that time. She lived till 1931 and was never sick again. She just put it behind her. Well, Charles was fascinated, and he had done all this reading, so he was well-grounded. And he was more interested in how this was working and what it meant. And he would spend hours in meditation, sitting on the porch often. I remember his granddaughter, Rosemary, telling me that she and a friend of hers were playing in the yard one day, and her friend said, Rosemary, I think your grandfather's dead on the porch. She said, no, he's just in silence. He started publishing. He started a magazine first called Modern Thought and later changed to Unity. Myrtle, people were attracted to her not because of her knowledge, although she was very, very bright. Her books are even more readable today than his, I think. She started prayer support. They would go to church on Sunday morning, they would gather in their living room Sunday afternoon, and they would support each other in prayer. And pretty soon word got out, and people started writing to her. And slowly she formed the Society of Silent Prayer. And she would tell people a specific time, it was always 11 o'clock Central Time on Sunday morning, whatever time that was for other people, they could work around it. They would gather in prayer together, wherever they were, whatever distance away. She didn't care, she didn't believe that distance mattered. And thus, obviously, Silent Unity was born. And we celebrate Unity's anniversary, so to speak, on 1889. When I went to ministerial school in the class of 91, I was lucky enough to be there for the centennial year. So there was a lot of people, a lot of joy around it. In 1914, the Unity School of Christianity was formed, and it was formed over Charles' vehement protest. He did not want to become a church. He did not want to become a movement. He wanted to be a force for change. He said if he hadn't chosen the name Unity, he would have chosen change as the name of the movement. But for legal reasons, for tax reasons, they had to incorporate, so they became the Unity School of Christianity. In 1928, he got the great idea that they needed a campus. And he found some land on the far reaches west of Kansas City, Missouri, and now it's one of the suburbs of Kansas City, Missouri. And he went to his board and said, I want to buy this land. Well, this was the height of the Depression. And they thought he was crazy. One board member threw a penny on the table and said, okay, there's your first contribution. Charles picked it up and blessed it and said, thank you. And he built Unity Village, which is still our headquarters today. It's a beautiful place. Has anybody been to Unity Village? It's a lovely place, isn't it? Very, very powerful, very peaceful. They have a huge and famous rose garden, a number of buildings. They have a tower. It's an amazing place, and it's amazing that he was able to pull that out of the Depression energy. So Unity continued to grow and expand. It was primarily, for a long time, it was primarily a home thing. People gathered in homes. For a long time, it was primarily a women's movement. Women seemed to get this message faster than men, and they really were drawn to it, partially because of Myrtle, I think, but just because of the message. They were more receptive to change, I guess, huh? But then, with World War II, with the GI Bill, a significant number of men wanted to attend as well, so it became more equal. One of those men was Eric Butterworth, who founded a church in New York City, which grew to huge size. He was speaking to a packed house in Avery Fisher Hall in Lincoln Center when he died. It was a very successful ministry, and his book, Discover the Power Within You, has become more or less the basic text of Unity. Charles' books are wonderful. The more I work with them, the more joy I feel in them, but they're very dense, and they're written in a style that is very dated. So you have to sort of plod through them a little bit. It's worth doing, but it's hard work. Whereas Harry Butterworth, that book was published, I think, in 1954, and so it's more current in its language and in its approach. There have been a number of, eventually the houses became centers, and then the centers became buildings. Although that's changing a little bit again. We're learning from religious science who have discovered that renting is far better than buying, because buying gets you into, building campaigns and ownership. It's just, it really locks you in. Whereas renting, Michael Beckworth, who's one of the primary New Thought speakers today, has a center in California. They were in a garage, really, and they worked to find a place that they could build. In Santa Monica, that's not easy. And eventually came to the realization that they were really happy where they were. So why move just because the idea, if you're successful, you have to own something, So they're still where they were, and they're very happy there, and full every Sunday. Okay, any quick questions? Yeah.
So was it ever actually a school, or was that just like a title?
Oh,
Did
no.
you actually have a school?
Unity
It was a
School exists, sure.
And it was a school right away, and then, but he
It
didn't
was a
really
school
want to
to train
incorporate.
ministers
I
right
see.
away.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
But they weren't like unity ministers, they were just sort of general Christian ministers?
Well, they were probably, I don't know, maybe they called themselves Society of, what am I trying to say? The Society of Silent Prayer, the Silent Prayer Ministers.
Oh, okay.
But it was the fact that ministers were taking the message out, and it was no longer simply entirely centered in their living room, that caused them to incorporate as the school of Christianity. And that today there are classes all the time. I mean, obviously I was trained there. There are weeks, people come in for a week or for 2 weeks to take a series of courses. It's very busy, yeah.
Could you tell us the basic difference between Christian Science and what grew out of Christian Science Unity?
This is going to be my opinion, because there's no measurable thing. Christian Science, what makes Unity unique in all of New Thought, separate from religious science, separate from Christian Science. It's the reason why in the early 1900s, 1918 I think, Charles Fillmore withdrew Unity from the global New Thought movement, because the difference was becoming too uncomfortable. And that difference is this: Unity is very, very Bible-based, very. Charles was deeply committed to Scripture, and much of his writings are that way, and still today. When I was in Oregon, I would get calls from Christian Science ministers all the time, religious science ministers, saying, oh, this thing came up from the Bible, tell me where it is or what it means. Because they're not trained in Bible the way we are. So there are differences there's a difference in how we approach prayer. You can see the relationship is much stronger than the differences, but there are differences. Yeah.
I remember as a kid seeing something on TV. Did Unity ever have anything on TV?
Oh, Charles Fillmore loved the media. He had a radio program. There was a radio station at the top of Unity Tower for a number of years. And yes, there are certain ministers, and the movement itself has advertised or had presence on television. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Alicia.
How and when did Unity go from being Bible-based and Christian-based to being more interfaith? Because that's how I often represent it when I explain to people what Unity is.
As far as Charles Fillmore was concerned, I think it was always interfaith.
Okay.
Unity services, and in my humble opinion, this is part of the reason there hasn't been as much growth as I think there should be. Ministers modeled their services on traditional Protestant services. You know, now we sing a hymn, and now we do a prayer, and now we have a reading, and that, the purpose of that was they didn't want to look too different. And somewhere along the way, and it hasn't been that long ago, they suddenly realized that their power and strength lies in the difference,
Yeah.
not in trying to be just like everybody else, but with a slightly different message. You know, that just doesn't work. Yeah.
Calling me
go.
Jane. Okay. Because I was raised the born-again kind of Christian, I don't see this as Christian,
Yeah.
because that was not my definition of Christian. And, my mother would have always thought this was heretical, and of course in miracles as well. So, and I resonate with this, not with you have to be born again through Jesus because you're going to hell, which is what Christianity is in my mind because of how I was raised.
There's that fine line. For fundamentalists, you have to accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, right? That's pretty much the tenet. We do not accept that. We accept Jesus Christ as a powerful teacher and a wonderful way shower, but we don't believe he ever tried to make himself separate from everybody else. And we don't believe that our path is to worship him. It's to discover the Christ within ourselves so that we can imitate him. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the basic difference between New Thought churches, Unity, and others, and traditional Christianity, is leaving out Christ in that role. But I grew up in St. Louis, and Kansas City actually spans Missouri and Kansas. It's a two-state city, and there was Unity Radio. You could get Unity Radio, but it was seen as kind of heretical, and it was like outside the Orthodox tradition and church. It's like, you know,
Trying to lead people astray.
It has a negative context.
alternative in a bad way.
Okay.
Yeah, but I went to Unity Village when I was only 16. I was raised in a Jewish tradition, and I got into the more mystical and study side of my Jewish youth group, and we went for a retreat to Unity Village for like a week for this Torah study thing. And I think it was one of the first places I went to where I could feel that presence of spirit in that holy place. And it's such a beautiful little town campus.
And so simple, which is what I love about it. They don't try to impress you with the buildings. The buildings are attractive and functional, but they're not impressive. The heart of Unity is really, well, partially silent Unity, the prayer ministry, but the other heart of Unity is a small chapel, about the size of this room. And it's completely bare, except painted on this wall is peace, be still. And chairs for meditating. Yeah.
So how many people, do you think it's common for people who attend Unity or follow Unity principles, et cetera, to identify themselves as Christian? Is that common, you think?
I would say it was once very common. There are still a lot of people who consider themselves Christians.
Okay.
There are people who go to Mass and then come to a Unity service, and they're able to do that. You know? Yeah.
Could you just explain, in a lot of traditional Christian churches today, there's now this whole big thing of the prosperity gospel. Did that come out of New Thought or Unity?
You betcha. It absolutely did. One of Charles Fillmore's books is called Prosperity. And he was very practical in the ways in which he applied and encouraged other people to apply truth, to apply these principles, to get relationships, to make money, for all the human needs. He took Jesus literally when he said, your needs will be met. The Father will meet your needs. And yes, so the prosperity movement started with New Thought. involved into Napoleon Hill and onward through there, and there is still a very,
People like Reverend Ike or,
well, Reverend Ike is not New Thought, but he certainly is familiar with New Thought and uses it
yeah.
totally.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
My idea around unity is that it's inclusive. I remember reading Daily Word, and one of the Block brothers, who's Jewish, really got turned on to unity. He kept his Jewish faith, but was very, and that's what unity says. You don't have, I gave it to my mother, who was a devout Roman Catholic, but she would still read it. It's like, unity doesn't proselytize, is my understanding. It's like, if it speaks to you, it speaks to you, and that's all that counts. And before I started, after I started coming to Unity, they did not take any kind of position on gay. It was totally, we don't have an opinion kind of thing. And as I understood it, when DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act stuff started to happen,
Yeah.
one of the guys, Jim Rosemurky, came in from Unity Village over to Somerville and talked, and he said, the two most oppressed groups throughout the history of religion, no matter what religion, were women and gays, or, gay and lesbian, whatever. So Unity then opened up and lost people. They lose people, when some of this stuff happens. Like, I even went on a retreat out there, and I would see people from around the world struggle with things like, what do you mean you don't believe in the devil? Really have this argument about, no, there is a devil or something, or trying to let go of that concept or whatever.
It's a process.
Yeah.
I was raised a staunch Catholic, and my family is to this day not comfortable with what I do.
Wow.
I always remember when I was in ministerial school, I called my Aunt Grace on her birthday, and we talked, and I eventually said, Aunt Grace, I've got to go now, we're going in to see a movie. And she said, oh, they let you out. She thought I was in some cult that, kept us apart from the world. Yeah.
And who is Napoleon Hill, and is there a more of a connected relationship between Unity and Christian Science, or is it just they sort of touched along the way? Was there a relationship between them? Did they break off from Christian Science, or totally
Christian
separate?
Science is pretty separate.
Separate, okay.
Unity is now part of the International New Thought Alliance,
Right.
which includes religious science.
Right.
Christian Science
But
is not.
No, but initially, I'm saying when they
Initially,
started.
it's like a branch leading
Branch,
off.
I see, yeah.
Emma Curtis Hopkins taught her own way. She did not just teach Mary Baker
Right,
Eddy's way.
yes.
She saw things differently. She taught things differently, and that was the energy from which Unity grew.
Wow,
Yeah,
wow.
Yeah.
Great.
Is Science of Mind anything that you're talking about right now, like?
Yeah, and
It's
Well,
religious science.
the Science of
Yeah.
Mind that many people from this congregation study with, like Martine?
Yep, Martine.
my understanding is that science of mind is closely related to religious science,
Okay.
more closely related, but they're intertwined.
What does
They're
that mean?
intertwined. We have a number of activities going on now that are intergroup. We're gradually learning how to get along with how to put our own principles into practice, I guess.
Science of mind and religious science are one and the same. I was part of a religious science church for many years before I came here. And the basic textbook is Science of Mind.
That is true. There was at one time, there were separate groups calling themselves Silence of Mind, separate from religious science. It's since been absorbed into one unit. But there are still, to this day, there are centers that call themselves Science of Mind. Yeah.
Yeah, is Unity considered a religion, or is it more a metaphysical society?
I think on its good days, it is less a religion. Because to me, how do you define religion? To me, there's all, inherent in religion is a giving away of some of your power. Putting an intercessor between you and God. I have to believe in this so that God will approve of me, rather than I'm directly connected with God, I'm one with God, so what's the question? Metaphysics it has kind of a negative meaning sometimes, but yes, I know Charles Fillmore intended it to be a metaphysical learning energy. That was his point. Yeah,
Can you
good.
speak to the paradox of that? Because you have so Christ was a Jew who came up with a kind of new perspective with love at the heart of it, and rather than the sort of perspective, more retribution oriented thing of the Old Testament, and I don't think ever wanted to create a church. And Charles Fillmore comes up with something that, to me anyway, rhymes with that, and didn't want to create a church. And yet, in both cases,
They did.
they did, because the only way to actually propagate stuff over time is through institutions, and institutions create all of their own.
And institutions begin to copy other institutions rather than stopping and saying, what as unity do we need a center to look like and to be and to contain? Setting aside whether it looks like a church or not, just what do we need it to be? Charles Fillmore, his biography is called American Mystic. And the more I read his work, and I still read it a lot, the more I understand that he truly was a mystic. He was an amazing man who took the principles that I've talked about and the paths that I've talked about and added to them and wove them into something really, really remarkable. So we can all study the Bible, but Charles Fillmore's take on the Bible is very different from what a Catholic take would be, or a traditional Protestant. Yeah, Alicia.
When and how did A Course in Miracles come to be so closely associated with unity?
I'm very vague on dates for Course in Miracles. I think it started when did I go to ministerial school? 89. So it started in the 80s, or it became really popular in the 80s.
Okay.
The connection, which was very controversial for a while, Unity did not approve of A Course in Miracles for some time. But groups started renting space in Unity centers. And those groups became very vibrant and alive. And they turned to Unity and started attending services, so that there was a separate energy, but they cooperated. The same is kind of true there's always been a close relationship between Unity and the 12 Steps.
Yes, I've noticed that as well.
Charles Fillmore was an alcoholic. Myrtle would not allow liquor to be served at any Unity school function, and that's still true today. And Bill Wilson used to do personal retreats to Unity Village, the co-founder of the 12-step programs. And again, how many meetings meet in Unity centers around the country. It just became a close. When I was the minister in Chicago, God, we loved them because, holy cow, did those people buy books? Our bookstore was always open when there was an AA meeting around because people loved to browse and buy books. It was a